The light stopped. Not a fading, not a sunset, but a sudden, violent erasure. Where once the golden and silver radiance of the two trees bathed the blessed realm in eternal warmth, now only a suffocating, unnatural gloom pressed against the world. In the city of Tirion, the white marble towers that had stood for ages as beacons of grace transformed into jagged, sightless tombstones under a morning sky. The inhabitants stumbled into the plazas, hands outstretched, grasping at a reality that had vanished in a heartbeat. They struck flint. They kindled torches, but the flames sputtered and died, choked by the thick, creeping shadow. The silence was absolute. Then, the news tore through the city like a physical blow. Finwë was dead. The Silmarils, the very soul of their craft and the heart of their light, were gone, stolen by the Black Foe. The realization settled over them, heavy as stone. The era of peace had ended. The world they knew had been hollowed out. Inside the royal hall, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and cooling stone. Fëanor stood alone at the center of the dais, his back rigid, his breathing rhythmic and shallow. He did not weep. He did not call for his kin. Instead, he held a jagged fragment of a broken heirloom, his fingers pressing so hard against the metal that the skin turned white. He traced the fractured edge with his thumb, the sharp point drawing a thin line of red, but he did not flinch. The pain was a tether, anchoring him to the present while his mind raced toward the horizon. He turned slowly, his boots scraping against the marble floor, a sound that echoed like a hammer strike in the cavernous room. His eyes were fixed on the north, piercing the shadows as if he could see through the curvature of the world, straight into the heart of the darkness of Angband. The grief that had paralyzed the city had not touched him. It had calcified. It was no longer a weight to be carried, but a fuel for a singular, burning purpose. He tightened his grip on the fragment, his jaw set, his gaze unblinking. Fëanor stepped out of the hall and into the vast, open plaza of Tirion. Thousands of Noldor stood in the gloom, their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped under the weight of the impossible loss. He did not wait for them to look up. He climbed the high stone steps, his stride rhythmic and heavy, until he stood above the sea of his kin. He did not raise his hands to beg for silence. He simply spoke. His voice cut through the stagnant air like a blade, resonant and cold, striking every corner of the square. He spoke of the light that had been stolen, of the desecration of their craft, and of the cowardice of those who would see them remain in the dark. The wind picked up, whipping through the plaza, but his words held steady, carrying a weight that forced the people to straighten, to lift their heads, and to turn their eyes toward him. He demanded defiance. He demanded they abandon the protection of the Valar and reclaim their honor by force. The sorrow that had gripped the city began to fracture. It was replaced by a sharp, gleaming resolve that rippled through the crowd like a rising tide. Fëanor turned to his 7 sons, who stood at the edge of the high platform, their faces mirrors of his own cold intensity. Behind them, the sky deepened into a bruised, storm-darkened violet, the clouds churning in silence. He raised his right hand, and his sons moved in perfect, terrifying unison. 7 blades slid from their scabbards, the sound of steel ringing out across the plaza like a tolling bell. The air in the square grew heavy, pressing down on the thousands gathered below. A sudden biting chill swept through the assembly, turning breath into mist and silencing the restless wind. Fëanor began to speak, his voice low and rhythmic, weaving a vow that felt like iron chains tightening around their very existence. He swore vengeance against any who would withhold the stolen light, be they Vala, elf, or man. His sons repeated the words. As the final syllable of the oath left their lips, a tremor passed through the ground beneath the feet of the host. The silence that followed was of a curse taking root. The silence in the plaza broke not with a shout, but with the rhythmic scrape of thousands of boots against stone. Fëanor stepped down from the platform, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and the host began to move. They turned their backs on the white towers of Tirion, leaving behind the only home they had ever known. Fingolfin stood at the edge of the assembly, his hands clenched at his sides. He watched the sea of his kin flow past him, their faces set in grim, unyielding lines. He reached out to touch the stone of a nearby pillar, his fingers tracing the carvings, sensing the shadow that now stained their path. The air grew colder as the procession stretched out, a long, dark ribbon winding down. From the heights of the city, thousands of elves carried their heirlooms, the metal clinking softly in the quiet. There was no music, only the sound of breath and the steady, relentless beat of feet on the path. The procession reached the coast, where the harbor of Alqualond opened like a silver crescent. Thousands of swan ships bobbed in the water, their hulls white and smooth, masts swaying in the salt-heavy wind. Fëanor stepped to the front of the host, his boots sinking into the wet sand. He looked out at the Teleri standing on the docks, their faces unmoving, their bodies blocking the path to the vessels. He raised his voice, demanding the ships, his tone cutting through the sound of the tide. The Teleri did not move. They stood in a line, arms crossed, their silence a wall more solid than stone. Pride met pride in the center of the harbor, and the air grew frigid, as if winter had descended upon the shore. Fëanor took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the leader of the Teleri. He repeated his demand, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous resonance that carried across the water. Still, the Teleri refused. Fëanor stopped. He looked down at the hilt of his sword, his fingers twitching against the grip. The air held its breath, waiting. The sound arrived first, a sharp metallic rasp that tore through the harbor air. Fëanor pulled his blade clear of its sheath, the steel catching the dim light and throwing a jagged reflection across the water. Behind him, the sound multiplied. Thousands of blades left their scabbards in a single discordant chorus that echoed off the white hulls of the ships. The Teleri recoiled. The realization hit them like a physical blow. This was no longer a dispute over passage, but a declaration of war against their own blood. Panic rippled through the ranks, a sudden frantic movement of bodies as they scrambled backward, away from the encroaching line of the Noldor. Fëanor did not hesitate. He stepped onto the pier, his gaze fixed on the vessels, his path cleared by the sheer threat of his weapon. The space between the two peoples narrowed until the distance was gone. The Teleri stood their ground, hands trembling as they reached for their own defenses, but the momentum had shifted. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and impending violence. Every eye was locked on the edge of a blade. The harbor of Alquilond fell into a silence so absolute it seemed the sea itself had ceased to move. The camera drifted over the white, elegant prows of the swan ships, their silver rigging catching the faint, dying light of the stars. Every blade was raised, a forest of steel, held in a trembling, collective breath. Fëanor stood at the center, his arm coiled, his focus narrowed to the single point where his path met the Teleri line. Time stretched, thin and brittle. Then, the tension snapped. A single arm moved. The first blade descended, a silver arc that cut through the stagnant air. It struck. The sound was not a clash of steel, but a dull, sickening thud that echoed off the white marble of the docks. A single drop of blood fell, dark and heavy, landing on the pristine stone of the pier. It spread, a small, widening stain. The peace of the world shattered in that instant. The Teleri cried out, a sound of profound, piercing grief. The Noldor surged forward, the line of steel breaking into a chaotic, violent tide. There was no turning back. The ships, once symbols of beauty and craft, became the stage for a slaughter. The light of their kin was extinguished. The tragedy was now a reality, marking the beginning of an endless, sorrowful war.